My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was elbow deep in drywall dust, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. Your grandmother left something in the will for you, she said. You need to come to the reading Friday. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stood in the middle of what used to be the living room of the house I'd been slowly renovating for 8 months. What kind of something? She paused just long enough that I knew the pause was intentional. The motel. And then she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not exactly. More like the kind of laugh people make when they're telling you a joke they already know the punchline to. Short. Dismissive. Like she was handing me a participation trophy and we both knew it. My grandmother had owned the Bluebell Motor Lodge for 41 years. It sat on a 2-lane road in rural Virginia, about 12 miles outside of a town that most people passed through without stopping. At its peak in the 1980s, it had 22 rooms, a small diner attached to the side, and a hand-painted sign out front that my grandfather built himself the summer before he died. By the time my grandmother passed, 14 of those rooms had water damage. The diner had been closed for 11 years. The sign had lost half its letters in a windstorm sometime around 2019, and nobody had bothered to replace them. My brother got the house in Charlottesville. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a finished basement, and a backyard that backed up to a small creek. My mother had been helping him look at kitchen renovation quotes before my grandmother was even in the ground. I got the motel. My mother said, "Sweetie, I know it's not ideal, but at least it's something. Maybe you can sell it for the land value." She said this the way people say things they've already decided aren't worth arguing about, like she was offering me a head start on the grieving process. My brother didn't laugh. He was more careful than that. He just nodded from across the conference table at the attorney's office and looked at the papers in front of him and said, "That's a shame," in a voice so quiet and sincere that I almost believed him. I signed the transfer documents. I drove out to the motel that afternoon by myself. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. The asphalt had buckled in 3 places. There were 2 dumpsters on the far side of the lot that had apparently been there since the previous tenant's abandonment, and someone had spray-painted a very detailed rendering of a sun on the side of the diner building. The gutters were detaching from the roofline on the north side. Room 7 had no door. I could see that from the car. I got out and walked every inch of it. And then I called my contractor. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I did not have a plan when I walked into that motel. I did not have some elaborate vision or a spreadsheet of projections. What I had was $12,000 in savings, a truck, a general contractor named Mr. Okafor, who had been doing honest work in the area for 22 years and had once told me I had a good eye for structure, and a deep and specific stubbornness that my family had always mistaken for stupidity. Mr. Okafor walked through the building with me the following week. He was quiet for most of it. He tapped walls and checked subfloors and stood in the diner for a long time, looking at the ceiling before he said, "Bones are good. Is that enough?" He thought about it. "Depends on what you're trying to do." I told him what I was thinking. Not a chain hotel, not a renovation flip, something slower. Boutique. 8 rooms instead of 22, done properly, with furniture I sourced myself and a real breakfast in the morning, and the kind of place that showed up on travel blogs because people actually wanted to go there, not because it had a loyalty points program. He looked at me for a moment. "That's going to take a while, I know, and money you probably don't have yet, I know that too." He nodded too. "Okay, let's make a list." We made a list. I applied for a small business loan through a local credit union, which took 6 weeks and required me to present a full business plan, profit projections, and a timeline that I revised 4 times before they approved it. I got a part-time job 3 nights a week waitressing at a steakhouse 30 minutes away so I could keep the renovation funded while the loan processed. I pulled permits. I learned more about Virginia's hospitality licensing requirements than I ever wanted to know. My mother called occasionally to check in, which mostly meant she called to ask if I'd listed the property yet. "I'm not listing it," I told her the 4th time she asked. "Honey, the market is decent right now. You could get a reasonable price for the land even if the structure—" "I'm not listing it." Another pause. "Well, just keep your options open." I did not keep my options open. I spent 14 months gutting and rebuilding 8 rooms of the Bluebell Motor Lodge. I kept the original sign frame my grandfather built and had a local artist repaint it in the original style. I kept the diner space but reimagined it as a communal breakfast room, with long farmhouse tables I found at an estate sale and had refinished. I planted a small kitchen garden along the south fence. I found a local coffee roaster, a local jam maker, and a woman in the next county who made the best biscuits I have ever put in my mouth, and was willing to provide them 5 mornings a week. I opened in the spring. The first weekend I was fully e-booked. By the end of the summer, I had a wait list. The travel piece came out in September, written by a blogger who covered hidden gem destinations along the East Coast. She had stayed 2 nights in room 4, eaten breakfast both mornings, and walked the property at sunset. The piece was warm and specific and completely unexpected. She described the Bluebell as the kind of place that makes you forget you had a phone. It was shared several thousand times. My inbox broke for about 3 days. My mother called the morning after it went up. She had seen it. A friend of hers had sent her the link. Her voice was different this time. "This is wonderful," she said, and I could hear something behind the words, some small recalibration happening that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge out loud. "Thank you," I said. "Your grandmother would be so proud." I let that sit there for a second. "She gave it to me," I said. "I think she already knew." I don't know if that's true. My grandmother was a quiet woman who never explained herself much, but I believe it, I have to. My brother texted that same week. He said congratulations and that he'd love to bring his wife and kids up sometime. I texted back a smiley face. I did not offer him a discount. It was the following spring when things shifted. My mother had been driving past the property on her way to visit a friend who lived about 40 miles north. She hadn't told me she was passing through, but she stopped and walked around the outside of the building, and apparently spent some time looking at the garden, and the new signage, and the patio furniture I'd added along the south side, and when she called me that evening, her voice was careful in a way that I had learned, over the years, meant she was building up to something. "It's really beautiful," she said. "The whole property, thank you." She stopped. Restarted. "There's a lot of space there, the back lot especially. Your grandfather always talked about putting guest cabins back there." "I know. I've thought about it. It might be worth exploring," she said, "if you had the right kind of support. Financially or otherwise." I asked her what she meant by otherwise. She said she'd been talking to my brother, that he had some money he was looking to invest. That it might make sense for the family to be involved, since it was a family property to begin with, and wouldn't it be nice to have that kind of stability and backing as I grew. I was quiet for long enough that she said, "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Let me think about it." I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to hang up and call Mr. Okafor. Here is what I knew that my family did not know. 3 weeks earlier, I had been approached by a small hospitality group based in Richmond that was interested in the Bluebell as part of a curated collection of boutique properties they were building across the mid-Atlantic. They weren't looking to buy me out. They were looking for a partnership, a licensing arrangement, branding support, a preferred vendor network, and access to their reservation platform, which was considerable. In exchange, they wanted a minority stake in the operating LLCs I had formed 18 months ago. The offer was real, and it was good, and I had already spoken to an attorney about it twice. My family didn't know about the LLC. I had formed it before I opened as a basic liability structure, and I had never mentioned it to anyone except Mr. Okafor and my attorney. It was nothing dramatic. It was just a standard single-member LLC registered with the Virginia State Corporation Commission, with me as the sole member and manager. I called my attorney the morning after my mother's phone call. "If my brother invests in the property directly," I asked, "what does that look like?" She walked me through it. Direct investment in real property was different from investment in the operating company. If my brother put money into the physical property, that created a potential co-ownership interest in the real estate itself, which was messy and complicated and would require its own legal structure. But investment in the LLC, a minority membership interest, was contained. It was defined by the operating agreement, and the operating agreement was something I controlled. "What if I amend the operating agreement before he invests?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what you're thinking," I told her. She said, "Give me a few days." I called my mother back and told her I'd thought it over and that I was open to having a conversation. I said I thought it was actually a lovely idea, the family being involved. I said my brother should come up and see the property, meet Mr. Okafor, understand what he'd be investing in. My mother was so pleased that she called my brother before she'd even hung up with me. My brother came up on a Saturday in April. He brought his wife. They walked the property, ate breakfast, sat on the patio. His wife said the biscuits were incredible. My brother took a lot of photos on his phone. He asked good questions about occupancy rates and seasonal patterns and what the expansion would look like. He seemed for the first time in my memory genuinely impressed. I gave them the full tour. I showed them the guest book. I showed them the booking system. I showed them the preliminary plans I'd drawn up for 3 cabins on the back lot, with a fire pit area and a small walking trail that would connect to a state park trailhead about a quarter-mile away. "This is serious," my brother said, standing at the back fence, looking at the lot. "It's always been serious," I said. "You just couldn't see it from Charlottesville." He had the decency to look a little uncomfortable. "I know. I'm sorry about that." I nodded. I let the moment be what it was. That afternoon, we sat at the farmhouse table in the breakfast vote with cups of coffee, and I walked him through the investment structure my attorney had prepared. It was a minority membership interest in the operating LLC, 15% in exchange for his capital contribution, which would fund the first phase of the cabin expansion. The operating agreement was 43 pages. My attorney had drafted it carefully and thoroughly. I had read every word of it. The relevant clause was on page 29. In the event that the property became subject to any local, state, or federal regulatory action, the minority member's capital contribution would be held in escrow until resolution, and any liability incurred during the pendencies of the action would be allocated proportionally based on membership interest, with the managing member retaining final decision-making authority and the minority member bearing no operational liability beyond their contributed capital. Except in cases where the minority member had exercised managerial control or made representations to third parties on behalf of the company. My brother's eyes skimmed that page the same way most people skim page 29 of an LLC operating agreement. He signed on a Thursday. "I need to pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if I tricked him, if the whole thing was a setup, if I invited him in just to spring a trap. That's not what happened. What happened is that I built something real, and my family wanted a piece of it after the work was done, and I was willing to let them in, but I was not willing to let them in without protection. Not for myself, for the business. For the thing I had spent 2 years bleeding over. The regulatory matter was not something I manufactured. It was something that already existed. 3 months before my brother signed, I had received a notice from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The Bluebell Motor Lodge, as it turned out, sat on a parcel that had been quietly designated as a contributing property to a historic district in the 1990s, a designation my grandmother likely never knew about or never understood the implications of. The designation didn't restrict my renovation, which I had done largely in keeping with the original structure, but it did affect the backlot expansion, because 2 of the 3 planned cabin footprints overlapped with a boundary that required a certificate of appropriateness before any new construction could begin. This was not a catastrophe, it was a bureaucratic process. My attorney had already begun working through it. But it was a regulatory action, and it was real, and it was disclosed in the operating agreement that my brother signed. My attorney had advised me to disclose it verbally as well. I did. I told my brother at the table before he signed that there was an ongoing matter with the State Historic Preservation Office and that we were working through it. He nodded. He asked how long it would take. I said a few months probably. He said okay. He signed. What I did not know, what nobody could have predicted, was what came next. 6 weeks after my brother signed, his wife told a friend of hers about the investment. That friend happened to work in commercial real estate and happened to know that there was a pending application from a regional hotel chain to build a limited service property on a parcel about 2 miles from the Bluebell. A new construction. Nothing to do with my property. But the friend mentioned, somewhat offhandedly, that some of the area historic district boundaries were currently under review by the county, and that certain properties might see their designation status change depending on the outcome. My brother called me. "Why didn't you tell me about the boundary review?" he demanded. "Because I didn't know about it when you signed," I said. "I found out last week. That changes everything." I waited for him to tell me what, exactly, it changed. He said he thought, given the regulatory uncertainty, that it made more sense for him to be more involved in the decision-making. That 15% was a significant investment, and he wanted to make sure it was protected. That maybe we should revisit the operating agreement. "The operating agreement," I said, "is a legal document we both signed. Things can be renegotiated." I was standing in room 4, the one the blogger had written about, making a bed. I smoothed a pillowcase and thought about how to say what I needed to say. "I don't want to renegotiate," I said. "But if you want to exit your position, we can talk about that." He did not want to exit his position. He called my mother. My mother drove up on a Wednesday without calling first. She knocked on the office door, and when I opened it, she walked past me into the room and sat down in the chair across from my desk. "We need to talk about this situation," she said. "There's no situation," I said. "There's a permit process that is moving forward. Your brother is worried. He can call my attorney if he has questions about the operating agreement." She looked at me the way she had looked at me my entire childhood when she thought I was being difficult. "I don't understand why you're being so rigid about this." "I'm being consistent," I said. "That's different." She said she thought, given everything, given that this was a family property originally, and that my brother had come in good faith and invested real money, that I owed it to the family to be more flexible, to consider their needs alongside my own. I looked at her for a long moment. "Mom," I said. "You laughed." She blinked. "What?" "When you called me to tell me about the will, when you told me I was getting the motel, you laughed." She opened her mouth and closed it. "You told me to sell it for the land value," I said. "You spent the next 14 months asking me when I was going to list it. You did not come see it until after a travel blogger wrote about it, and her post got shared 6,000 times. The room was very quiet." "I am not rigid," I said. "I have an operating agreement that my attorney drafted, that I disclosed fully, that your son signed with full information. I run a real business. I have staff who depend on me. I have guests who book months in advance. And I am not going to compromise any of that because the investment your son made might take longer to pay off than he expected." My mother sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't realize." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's why we're having this conversation." The certificate of appropriateness came through in August. It took 4.5 months. The county's boundary review concluded the same week, and the Bluebell's designation status remained unchanged, which was fine because we'd already adjusted the cabin footprints to work within the existing boundary. The revised plans were actually better. Smaller footprints, better sited, more privacy between units. We broke ground on the first 2 cabins in September. My brother's capital contribution funded both of them as intended. His 15% interest had not been diluted, had not been encumbered, and would generate its first distributions the following fiscal year, which my accountant projected would represent approximately an 18% annual return on his initial investment, assuming conservative occupancy estimates. He texted me in October to say he was sorry for how he'd reacted in the spring. I called him back, which I think surprised him. We talked for almost an hour. I told him about the plans for the 3rd cabin, which I was funding myself. I told him about the kitchen garden expansion and the new relationship I'd built with a local winery about a mile down the road. He told me about some things happening in his own life, work stuff, pressure he'd been under. I listened. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in probably 10 years. I don't know if my family will ever fully understand what I built here. I'm not sure it matters anymore. What I know is this. My grandmother drove 12 miles outside of town every morning for 41 years to open a motel that most people thought was an afterthought, and she did it because she understood something about that land that nobody else bothered to look closely enough to see. I looked. The cabins opened the following April, right around the time the dogwoods bloom along the back fence. The first guests to stay in cabin 1 were a couple from Philadelphia who had found us through the hospitality group's platform. They checked in on a Friday and checked out on a Sunday and left a note on the farmhouse table in the breakfast room that I found after they'd gone. It said, "Thank you for this place. We needed it more than we knew." I kept the note. I put it in the guest book. That evening, I walked out to the back lot and stood in the dark for a while, looking at the 2 little cabins with their lights on, and the empty footprint where the 3rd one would go, and the sky above the tree line that in Virginia in April is almost impossibly full of stars. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon phone call. I thought about the laugh, and I thought, thank you. Really, thank you for giving it to me.